It's always dangerous in 2025 to bank on a group of people having seen the same television show. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to ask if people are watching a show. Just give me a nod or a raised hand if you're watching Your Friends and Neighbors on Apple TV with John Hamm. Okay, great. So first of all, no one's spoiling anyone else because no one else in the room has seen it. It's about 5 episodes deep of a show. It's a dramedy, a dark comedy. And all you need to know for the premise of the show, without spoiling a thing, besides the fact that it's a great show, is that this is somebody who lives in a wealthy neighborhood in Connecticut who loses everything. His wife, trust from his family, his job, relationships with his friends, because unfortunately those relationships were broken once things were kind of off with his family. Now he's got broken relationships with friends. He's lost absolutely everything. And in the wake of losing everything, the thing that's worth writing a fictional TV show about this character is that he decides that the way he's going to sustain himself is by means of robbing them. So I'll come back to this at the very end, but I thought that I would open with a question, and it will be a rhetorical question because we're short on time, so I don't have time to hear the stories, but I want you to go ahead and think to yourself about a time when you held a grudge. It could be right now, that's fine, but we're not going to share them out loud. Just think about it. Think about who the grudge was against, why you were holding that grudge, and what did it mean to hold a grudge? Because holding a grudge sounds like it would be an emotional or relational state of being. But the rabbis did not explain a grudge as such. They say that grudge is a matter of action, and that's what we're going to do deeper study into today. If you open up your Chumash to page 697, next week's Parsha is Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, and this is from the tail end of Kedoshim, a series of laws in which we are taught how to behave horizontally in this world. You know what I mean when I say horizontally? Vertically, 697. Vertically, we have laws about the way in which we must obey God or behave in front of before God. Horizontally, we have laws and rules that tell us how to behave with each other. This is part of a series of how to behave here on earth with other human beings. That's what this is. We're looking at chapter 19, verse 18. Lo tikom velo titor. Lo tikom velo titor. These are 2 words that can be translated interchangeably, but for the sake of the conversation today, we're going to call the first one lo tikom, vengeance, and we're going to call the second one bearing a grudge. Okay? Lo tikom velo titor et b'nei amecha. You shouldn't carry out vengeance or hold a grudge against who? Against the stranger? I mean, probably also not the stranger, but here in the verse, against your people, Israel. Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, and you shall love your kinsman as yourself, ani Adonai. We're not going to get into the sign-off of I am the Lord your God at the end of many of these verses in this section, but it is like a tagline for the Lord Almighty. I'm God and I said so. How many people, right, in their life have had an authority figure close out an instruction with, because I'm your mom, because I'm your teacher? In fact, how many people sitting here have been that person? It's not just because I said so, it's because I'm in this position of authority. That's as deep as we're going to go about the end of the verse. We're going to focus on the beginning. When we talk about vengeance or bearing a grudge, lo tikom velo titor, do we seem to be talking about our fellow Israelites or strangers? Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha comes immediately following this instruction, and you shall love your re'echa as you love yourself. What is re'echa in this part of the Torah? What's the Levitical, the Vayikra take on re'echa? Your kinsman, your person, okay? So we're going to connect the lo tikom and lo titor to this idea, since it's immediately followed, and you should love. Okay, we're going to get back to that vav there, and you should love, before the end of our conversation today. Because the question is, are these really that deeply connected? You shouldn't carry out vengeance, you should not bear a grudge, and you should love your neighbor. Is that a third and separate command, or is that connected deeply to the idea of vengeance and a grudge? Hold that thought and take a look at these source sheets that I'm going to pass around, that I forgot until this moment I hadn't passed around. Great. Brian, would you send these around this way, please? Just send them down the line. Great. And see if we'll send them down this way. Perfect. You're very welcome. Okay. Oof. Okay. I'm going to try not to rush through this, but I'm going to ask for your help. Believe it or not, in this room, when you're whispering to each other, when you're talking with each other in the side, it's actually very hard and very distracting to get through this quickly. And also, it might be forget about me. You don't have to worry about distracting me, but you might be distracting a neighbor. So I'm going to ask to be kind, because ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. You should love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that was a Vayikra joke. Now, that is another shiur. What if you don't love yourself? Then we've got bigger things to talk about. It's a great question, but we're not going there today. The first source on the page following this verse from Torah comes from a Masechet of Talmud called Yoma. Earlier this week, I made reference to this in Daily Minyan. A few of you are there, because I shared a teaching from Rabbi Akiva from the end of Mishnah Yoma, and I explained that Yoma mostly deals with the laws of Yom Kippur. But as in all Talmud, it wanders and goes back and forth into other categories. And in this particular page, the 23rd page on the front side, we learn some Torah, in quotes, about the Torah of lo tikom v'lo titor. Reading from that second source. Who does not avenge himself and bear a grudge like a snake when insulted is not considered a Torah scholar at all. If you don't take vengeance and you don't hold a grudge, then it's like you're not even a Torah scholar. Immediately, this is the exact opposite of what we learned, and that's what the comment in the Talmud is going to be. As it is important to uphold the honor of Torah and its students by reacting harshly to insults. That's a Steinsaltz commentary. But the Gemara then asks in return, wait, hang on, but isn't it written explicitly in the Torah? This verse, lo tikom v'lo titor et b'nei amecha. Aren't you not supposed to take any sort of vengeance or bear any grudge against your people? And the Gemara, the narrative voice of the Gemara, responds back to the question. You notice that? The Gemara asks, the Gemara responds. This is just an internal conversation of the rabbis. That particular law, that prohibition, is written when it comes to monetary matters and not personal insults, as it was taught in a Braita. What is this notion of lo tikom and lo titor? It refers to, one said to their fellow person, re'echa, your fellow person, as in the verse, lend me your sickle. What's a sickle? A gardening tool, if you will, an agricultural tool. Okay? Lend me your sickle. And the second guy said, no. The next day, the other one came back to him and said, the one who had refused to lend the sickle, and said to the first guy, hey, lend me your axe. And then if the first guy said, I will not lend it to you because you did not lend yours to me, that is considered Vengeance, revenge. Okay, that's considered revenge. So what the rabbis want to make very clear here, and we're going to get to a Rashi. I actually found this backwards because I knew this Rashi commentary on the Parsha, but then I went back and found where Rashi is picking this up from. Rashi, this is codified by the year 600. Rashi is way later, but somewhere between the 11th and 13th century. Rashi would have taught this particular piece that I'm about to teach to you. But based on this idea in Yoma, and Rashi, like the Talmud, is assuming that when we talk about taking vengeance or holding a grudge, we are not talking about someone being a jerk to you, because that is a different matter altogether. What do we call it when we go to somebody and we, what's the word? We adjure them. That was the fancy word I was looking for. When we say to somebody, you shouldn't behave that way, you shouldn't talk to me that way, you shouldn't act like that. What do we call that? Reprimand, good. What do we call it in the Torah? Tochecha. We call it tochecha. We call it reprimands officially. These are sometimes known as curses, but it's not curses. Tochecha, as a notion broadly, not from God to the people, from people to people, is, hey, it wasn't cool when you did that to me. Typically speaking about the emotional and the relational. But we are talking about things of monetary or economic marketable value. This is what they want us to know. Does everyone get that? We're in the realm of, lend me this. No, I won't lend it to you. And next day, lend me your axe. No, I won't lend it to you. All right. So that's the realm that we're in. Now we're going to look at Rashi. Rashi brings this exact story. It's the third source. If one says to another, lend me your sickle, and the second person says, no. And the next day, the second person says to guy number one, lend me your hatchet. And the first guy says, I'm not going to lend it to you just as you refuse to lend me your sickle. This is avenging. So what's the other one? What is the bearing a grudge? If the first guy says to the other, lend me your hatchet, and the second guy says, no. And the next day, the second one says, lend me your sickle. And the first one replies, fine, here it is. I'm not like you because you wouldn't lend it to me. And therefore, I'm better than you. What is this? That is called natira, which is related to lo titor. That's bearing a grudge because he still has this notion of the core of that verb at his heart, which is enmity. What is that fancy word, enmity?
Animosity.
Okay, it's related to the notion of animosity. Generally speaking, it is animated, to use that word, by somebody being frustrated with another party. And enmity is when it's not necessarily that you refuse to do something, it is an adverbial way of going about doing something. Ugh. Fine, I'll clean up the living room. But only because my brother, he never cleans up the living room, but I'm better than that, and so I'll clean up the living room. That, my friends, is doing something with a grudge on your heart, says Rashi. This is the differentiator. Do we understand this?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
Lo, you don't understand? Okay. The first kind, this idea of lo tikom, is no, I will not lend that to you because you didn't lend it to me. The lo titor is fine, you can have it. I can't believe you wouldn't give your thing to me, but you can have it. I'm better than you. That's the second. Got it? Okay. So now we're going to flip the page and we're going to skip some sources and go to source number 6 because first of all, we're short on time, and second of all, that probably should have been the order. We're going to take a look at the Chorny. I think it's 15th century. Anyone know better than me on that? Okay, I think it's 15th century. I was trying to put this in chronological order. The Chorny says, Rashi explains this verse by providing us with this parable. I'm not going to repeat it, but what happened? There was a sickle, there was an axe. He says, if one says, no, don't bear, okay, what's the meaning? Skip ahead and down to What then is the meaning of lo titor? This is the same question that Rashi asked. The answer, if the second person does lend a spade to the other one, but he adds, I am not like you who refused me this scythe yesterday, the second person still feels vengeful, even though he did not act vengefully. And if you were to ask, why is it that the Torah did not specifically forbid the first person to refuse to lend the second person his scythe, but referred with obvious displeasure to the second person who did lend his tool as having committed a violation of the commandment? Back up. Wouldn't you have thought that our rabbis, at the least, perhaps the Torah itself, would have said, the guy who says, no, you can't have my axe because you wouldn't give me your sickle. Wouldn't you think that that would be a problematic thing that should be tisk? But the Torah does not bother itself with that, nor does Rashi comment on that idea. Why is it more of a concern that someone would come and actually lend the item, but be a jerk while doing it? So he's going to explain, the Chizkuni is going to explain this idea, okay? Surely, the Torah should have criticized the first person for being so miserly as not to lend his tool to his neighbor. We must give the first person the benefit of the doubt for refusing to lend his tool because he may have been afraid that his neighbor would treat his scythe, that first, remember, guy number one wants to lend the sickle, the scythe, which he treasured greatly. And he's worried that this person's going to treat it carelessly, and that would explain his refusal. Pause. Would that be an okay reason not to lend something? Are we allowed to say, no, you may not borrow that thing from me? Are we allowed to do that, particularly when there is a concern for someone damaging our property? Are we allowed to do that? According to the Torah, you are allowed to choose not to share, meaning the way that Rashi reads the Torah says, yeah, you can say that you're not going to share because sometimes we have good reason. I do find myself sometimes saying to my kids, you know what, that toy is something that your brother or sister earned and worked very hard to get, and it's their right to say, no, I'm not going to lend it. But Chizkuni keeps going. The Torah does not command us to lend our tools against our better judgment as to whom we entrust it. On the other hand, the second person made it clear that he bore the first person ill will for his refusal, and he wanted to impress him as being a better person than his neighbor. Therefore, the Torah commanded us to allow our goodwill towards our neighbor to outweigh our disappointment over his having refused us without giving an adequate explanation, which would have been fine, it would have been acceptable, and which would have avoided any ill feeling between two people. When we practice this kind of goodwill, we contribute to making this a more peaceful world. In other words, the Torah says it's okay to make decisions about your property that are not sharing decisions. It's not okay to be the kind of person who shares, but to treat people poorly while you share. Better that you not share with somebody than to share and to be rude and perhaps cruel when you do it. Interesting, right? Now, I'm not saying this is the way you have to feel about it. I'm just explaining how Rashi and Chizkuni read the situation. The Mishnah Torah continues. Now we're moving on to the Rambam. Take a look at source number 7. A person who takes revenge against a colleague transgresses a Torah prohibition, which says, do not take revenge. And even though revenge is not punished by lashes, it is a very bad trait. Instead, a person should train themselves to rise above their feelings, above all worldly things, for people of understanding consider all these things as vanity and emptiness, which are not worth seeking revenge for. What's meant by taking revenge? And then he shares the story that we've gone over and over again. This is considered as taking revenge, last 5 lines here. Instead, when he comes to ask him for it, he should give it to him with a full heart without repaying him for what he did. What does Rambam mean by repaying here? Without repaying the first guy for what he did. Without saying, I'm going to go, you went low, I'm going to go low. Right? I'm going to be I'm going to come back at you because you wouldn't lend it to me. And I want you to know I'm better than you in that regard. They say the thing that the Torah is nudging at us to do is to say, if somebody asks to borrow someone else's tool or something of value, and that second person says no, and then that same second person wants to go back and ask the first person for something, the first person ought to rise above if they can find it in themselves to do so. There is no added value in doing it, but doing it with a grimace and doing it rudely. How do we know that that's the thing that we're supposed to learn from this verse? I want you to go back to the fifth source. I want you to go back to the fifth source. By the way, pause on this idea for a second. I think it's worth taking 30 seconds to say, I think it's human nature to want to do what the Torah is telling us we ought not to do. I think that for two reasons. Number one, I've experienced it many times in my life. When someone is rude to me, I am not motivated to be kind back to them, particularly in sort of reciprocal circumstances where they're asking me the same thing I asked them and they weren't kind about it. But in this case, the Torah is reminding me that not sharing is not the same as not kindness. That's hard to keep in mind. Someone else not sharing with me, it might be miserly, but it's not unkind. And they may have good reasons. That's what the Torah is trying to remind me. The second thing is that the Torah does not bother, nor do our commentators like Rashi and Rambam and Chizkuni, bother to legislate against something that's not a problem. If people went ahead and just shared with each other nicely, regardless of previous engagements over things of value, we wouldn't have to be taught this. This is something that people struggle with. I do not think people naturally do this. I think it's unnatural. Take a look at Ramban, and this is where we're going to close for the day. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. It's in the same verse, remember? It's the second half of the verse. You can look back at it on page 697. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is an expression by way of overstatement. For a human heart is not able to accept a command to love one's neighbor as oneself. Got that? Ramban says, not possible. It's exaggeration. We never love our neighbors completely the way that we love ourselves. And he goes on to outline this. And I think that this is a very painstaking and perhaps heartfelt and based on lived experience commentary. Moreover, Rabbi Akiva has already come and taught that your life takes precedence over the life of your fellow being. Rather, the commandment of the Torah means that one is to love one's fellow being in all matters, as one loves all good for oneself. It is possible that since one does not say, and thou shalt love et reacha as yourself, but instead likes it to le reacha over, meaning to liken to your neighbor as yourself, that the meaning thereof is to equate the love of both yourself and your neighbor, or maybe yourself and the person who is a ger tzedek, somebody who converts to Judaism or joins the people in your mind. For sometimes a person will love their neighbor in certain matters, such as doing good to him in material wealth, but not with wisdom and similar matters. This is the crux of his argument. Sometimes we feel really comfortable sharing our hose with our neighbor, but there are limits to how generous we're willing to be with neighbors. But if he loves him completely, he will want his beloved friend, he says, to gain riches, properties, honor, knowledge, and wisdom. However, because of human nature, he still will not want him to be his equal, for there will always be a desire in his heart that he should have more good things than his neighbor. Do you understand what is being taught here? That we are uncomfortable with giving to our friends until they have even the same amount as us, let alone even more than us. I baked all these cookies. Here, you want some cookies? That's neighborly. You know what most people don't do? Oh, I baked these cookies. Oh, I love those cookies. Thanks for those cookies. Oh, you do? You can have all of them, right? Just to use cookies as an example. But imagine the stakes when it's something other than cookies. We don't feel comfortable necessarily granting that over to other people until the point where they have even as much as us, let alone more than we have. And then they give an example. So scripture commands that this degrading jealousy should not exist in the heart, but instead a person should love to do abundance of good for their fellow being as one does for themselves, and they should place no limitations upon their love for the other person. We don't have time to get into the Yonatan and David example. It's a really beautiful one. I encourage you to read it. But I want to wrap on this to explain that I believe that what we're getting from Ramban, the Nachmanidean charge here is to say, at the same time, there's no way you are going to love your neighbor the way that you're going to love yourself. It is absolutely the case that there are limits to the way in which you're going to love your neighbor. But to the extent to which you can charge yourself and push yourself to do the following, you are making more peace in this world, were the words of who made more peace in this world, the Mishnah Torah. Right? Rambam says you're making more peace in this world if you do two things. Number one, when someone was not generous with you and you choose to be generous with them, don't point that out. And number two, when you don't point that out, that you are being more generous than they were. Exactly. It's a challenge. He doesn't think it's easy. He doesn't think it's human nature. He doesn't think people are going to do this. He doesn't expect people to do this. But he expects people to challenge themselves to do two things. Number one, not to point out that they are being better than the other person, when they are in fact being better than the other person to a certain extent, or maybe not being better, but maybe it feels like they're being better, right? Because remember that we think that it's possible for someone to have had a good reason not to be generous. The second thing that's so important that he says is that we should push ourselves not to get angry, uncomfortable, resentful, and vengeful when we realize that by being generous to someone else, they've attained more than us. I'm gonna close with a story, with a parable, not from your friends and neighbors, because I don't want to spoil the show. I remember very well a friend of mine who went down the path of being a triple threat and being on Broadway. She had a roommate who was often auditioning for similar shows as her. But she, my friend number one, was a very, very talented singer with not so much dancing experience. And her roommate was mostly a dancer who could also sing. And she told me a story over drinks one night about a time where the two of them were going out for the same audition. And her friend, the second person, the dancer, asked the singer, my closer friend, do you think that you could help and coach me a bit on my singing audition? Lo and behold, the dancer, whose friend, the singer, helped her out, got the role over this person. Not only did they get the role over this person, but that person went on to have a much more quickly successful career, so to speak, on the stage than the first person. Situations like that arise all the time, particularly when we're in the same business as someone else. I think this is economic wisdom, market wisdom. I think it's wisdom particularly in tight-knit Jewish communities where we are interfacing with our friends' businesses all the time. I remember this feeling at the end of cantorial and rabbinical school placement. Right? It's really hard to be generous and help out a friend when you know that the outcome might be that they take the very position or find a more successful position than you do. In my life, I've experienced it, and I know you have too, and if we had more time, I would want to hear maybe some stories of these experiences from you. But I want to encourage you to take this challenge into your life, knowing there's no way you're going to fully meet it, because it's not human nature to do so. But to be as kind as possible, even when you're being more generous than the next person. You'll know you're being better than the other person. And furthermore, to try not to hold a grudge or to want to seek vengeance if we find that somebody that we went out of our way to help turns out to have leapt off of that success to attain what we perceive as more than ourselves.